Our topic for the Dynamic Boards NED community today is culture and the board, and our speaker is our very own Louise Wilson. Louise is an experienced business and HR leader, board member and non-exec director with deep and current experience supporting global brands. Her executive experience includes being a global people director for The Body Shop and a chief people officer for Clark's Shoe Company, as well as senior roles with Marks and Spencer's, British Airways, Menzies Aviation and Emirates Airline. A lot of big names there, Louise. Louise is a non-exec director and chair of Remuneration and People Committee for Suffolk Group Homes, trading as Vertas Group, A2 Dominion Housing and Saffron Building Society. She also sits on a number of additional committees, including Audit and Risk and Nominations. She's a trustee and chair of the Remuneration and People Committee for the British Heart Foundation, and is also an advisor and associate for a number of organisations and specialises in purpose-led leadership and culture, organisational design and development and transformation areas. Louise, what an incredible array of experience you've had on boards and supporting the boards as an exec before that. It is fantastic to have you with us. You've been part of this community for a very long time. And I know along the way, you have supported me and many others when they've needed situational or interview kind of prep kind of support, all sorts of different things. So Louise, thank you for being such a great member of the community. And we are eager to hear your thoughts.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me to be a guest speaker. It's very weird being on this side of the room, so to speak. So as Sarah says, delighted to see everybody today. I am just one of the group is what I've written down here. I'm not an expert, but having been in HR executive, I guess, for 30 years and now a NED for 6 years, culture and the board and whether culture is a strategic asset or a risk is a key topic that I'm really interested in. And based on the number of people here today, it looks like you are as well, which is great. So my views are based on my experience, where I've seen that a strong culture can really enable strategy execution and build trust, and where a weak culture can drive poor decisions. And as we read about in various case studies, it can drive misconduct and significant reputational damage for businesses. If we think of culture, the definition of culture as sort of shared values, beliefs and behaviours that shape how people in an organisation think, act and make decisions, so basically how things get done, then there has to be a really critical role that the board plays in impacting that culture. Part of the issue, honestly, for me, is that we tend to think as boards about culture only in a crisis rather than part of what we do and display every day. And in my opinion, boards need to ensure that culture both protects and creates value, and that we have a continuous focus on it, not just responding to those crises that we might be aware of, like Oxfam and the BBC, and we can all name the ones that have been big in the press. But those are in very, very hot moments. And actually, in my view, the board can impact culture literally on a day-to-day basis. So my little talk is going to cover 3 main areas. My view on how the board sets the tone in terms of culture, the board measuring culture, and then some alternative views, because I know that not everybody agrees with my point of view. So I thought I'd put some of the alternative views in there as well. So from setting the tone, I mean, we have this weird job, don't we, as non-execs? We have significant influence, but without direct control. We're ultimately accountable. And I think that the board behaviour has a role in defining culture, although we don't manage it operationally on a day-to-day basis, but we must impact it through our governance and our behaviours. And our influence comes from that independent challenge, the oversight of behaviours, and ensuring alignment between the stated values of our organisations and putting them into practice. Of course, there are also board dynamics, and our own actions and behaviour signal what matters. But why would some people think that culture is for the executive? We don't think that for risk, we don't think it for governance, we don't think it for strategy, and we don't think it for oversight. And culture bleeds through an organisation. So I think the way the board behaves cascades through the organisation. And in terms of culture, specifically, obviously for a board, there are other aspects that are specific to the board, like groupthink, lack of challenge and over dominant voices, which will actually impact the culture of the board, not just the culture of the organisation. So Sarah asked me to give a couple of examples when I was thinking about my input. So there's a board that I'm on that has been through a regulatory downgrade. And the way the board responded to that has set the cultural tone in the organisation as to how they responded to the downgrade. So the board has lent in, been really calm but clear, focused on actions, supportive, very responsive to resource needs, giving huge amounts of extra time attending regulatory and staff meetings and showing real accountability. And I think they were all cultural indicators as to how the organisation and the various teams should deal with their role in that regulatory downgrade work. Same with the board that I've been on, where we had to write off a significant sum of money invested in a failed project. Now, culture impacted this, I think, both during the time of the project, where actually the board, there wasn't enough challenge, there wasn't enough recognising the need for additional expertise, and there wasn't enough holding the exec to account, all cultural. And then actually the decision for the write-off, which was a huge decision for the organisation. So taking accountability for that, clarifying the reasons why, commissioning third parties for lessons learned activity, and actually actively holding a board workshop on what we didn't do very well and what we should directly learn from that. Again, were all cultural indicators. And then the other one I put was, as an executive, I've no doubt that many of you would have an example like this when you weren't on a board. So I was a head of HR, I won't say where. I was asked to present to the main board, which for me at that time in my career was really, really big, and for my function. So I travelled to a specific offsite location. It was miles away, and I remember it pouring with rain, and I got very wet. Put in hours of prep, bought a new dress, and was then stood down, having sat outside the boardroom almost the whole day. And as the board discussions had run over, there was no room for our slot. So to me, that was a cultural indicator. And also it was the fact that the poor company secretariat had to come out and stand me and the other person down. Not even one of the Neds came out and just explained the reasons why. So what did I go away with a view of the board and the culture and whether HR was important to that board or not? All cultural indicators. So I think boards have a role to align purpose, values and strategy and ensure that the culture supports the delivery. And as Neds, we need to test whether values are genuinely lived or simply stated or simply aspirational. But it's actually what we do on a day-to-day basis that I think sets the tone. So I've got a few examples of things that hopefully you're all doing as Neds. So we're making decisions about customers and whether, for example, they reflect the needs of vulnerable customers or underrepresented stakeholders. That's culture. Our approach to ESG and attitude to reputational risk, that's culture. Considering how our decisions will be perceived by our customers, by regulators and staff, that's culture. Understanding what unintended consequences might arise from our strategic choices, so effectively weighing up possible outcomes, focusing on leading indicators, that's all cultural. Proactively building trust and transparency with external stakeholders, working those relationships, recognising and respecting those relationships, that's culture. One thing that every board does, I did it last week on a board and said I was going to use it as an example in this talk, aligning on risk appetite. So lots of people see that as a technical thing to do. It's a risk conversation, but actually our decisions on where each risk falls and our appetite for that and how we cascade that through the organisation, that's definitely culture. Examples I've given already of focusing on lessons learned and a board's attitude to encouraging the organisation to do that as well as doing it for themselves. That's culture. To me, they're all things that we're doing as Neds and as boards every day in our Ned roles, and they're all part of culture. So then in terms of the second area about measuring culture, so governing culture is part of our Ned responsibilities. It's not necessarily that easy to do. So we need to have mechanisms in place to ensure that that culture moves from statement to measurement, just like we do with risk. So we state a position on risk, and then we look for controls, we look for actions, and we look for evidence that tells us that that risk is being effectively managed, and culture is exactly the same. So we need to look at different sources, things like engagement data, things like complaints, whistleblowing, customer outcomes, just achievement of our strategy and our objectives, audit findings. They're all business result areas that can tell us around cultural indicators. And there's opportunities for us to look at the more qualitative areas as well. So I think in the more recent IOD report about the role of the NED, they talked a lot about visits and getting engaged with the business. So where we're interacting with colleagues, where we're undertaking visits, meeting talent that we get to spend time with, stakeholders or shareholders that we get to spend time with and interact with, everything they're saying and feeling about the leadership of the organisation, that's additional data, and we can triangulate that with the hard data. So we need to report on culture, and I think that's evolving a lot. It certainly has already, and I've only been around as a NED for 6 years. I think lots of stakeholders expect boards to describe now their cultural efforts and evidence how culture is shaping performance management, decision making, and risk outcomes. And of course, we need to be not just as ever looking at past actions, but looking at risks and emerging behavioural trends, so leading indicators, and most importantly, linking those to our strategic objectives. So it's not culture and measuring culture for the sake of it, but in the context of wanting to achieve our strategy and our aims. There's also one piece that I think that we hold in our hands as boards that's very specific, which is around creating that environment about speaking up and psychological safety. So cultures help an organisation to achieve its business strategy, but it also determines whether employees and colleagues will speak up and raise concerns, and whether issues are addressed early or not. So at NEDS, there's something about us trying to advocate and ensure that we have and promote a strong speak up culture, and that we've got mechanisms for that, and we're hearing reports and information and data on that. And of course, we can encourage challenge in the boardroom ourselves to demonstrate that in action. Incentives and behaviour and recruitment are all part of culture, so we can reinforce it by remuneration, by how we go about performance management, by promotion decisions, by how we hold the organisation to account. And there's something for us to ensure that the incentives are supporting the desired culture rather than undermining it. Culture is often part of what I call the how, in terms of how goals and strategy are achieved, along obviously with skills. So one board I'm on, we've implemented people, planet, profit measures into the LTI. And interestingly, I got a third party recently, a consultancy, to review it. And they said, oh, not many people do have people in there, as if it was the wrong thing. And my challenge back was, why does it make it wrong just because there aren't many organisations that are doing it? To this organisation, measuring their people element and measuring that over a long term is really important to its business results, its strategy and its culture. And of course, as NEDs, under measurement, we need to look out for those warning signs. So we need to look out where there are gaps between the stated values and behaviours, maybe lack of challenge, high turnover, recurring complaints, overconfidence in leadership narratives, too much reassurance and not enough assurance. So we need to be brave enough to say, don't just tell me it's all okay, show me why it's okay. Give me the information, the data that shows me that it's okay, and get that assurance. So then I said I'd just finish with some alternative views. I know that some people do view that the board has a limited role in culture, and really the executive and the middle management own it and set the tone, because we're not interacting on a day-to-day basis in the same way. I think if you looked at some of the examples, BBC, the Post Office, Carillion, you could say that boards had failed on culture by ignoring warning signs and challenging behaviours, but I know that that's the view of some people. So I've got a few quotes, and these come actually from a number of sessions that I've attended, from some of the WhatsApp groups that I'm on for NEDs, including the Dynamic Boards WhatsApp group. Admittedly, some of these were referring to crises situations, but these are the kind of things that people like us have said. So some of them support my view. Boards aren't there to micromanage every decision. Mistakes will happen, but they set the foundations and the scaffolding, the tone, the questions, the guardrails. And when they neglect that role, the risks can multiply. The culture of the board is key in reducing the risk of crisis events happening. Senior executives in an organisation may well mirror and or reflect the culture of its board and what is deemed as acceptable behaviour. Somebody said boards do set culture and should embody the values of an organisation. In my experience, board members can be overly focused on finance, governance and regulatory, and customer, employee and culture come too far down the agenda. An alternative view: I don't think boards set culture. Senior executives in the trenches set the culture on a daily basis. Another alternative view: to set culture, you have to be present daily, and as NEDs, we're not. So it's impossible for us to impact what trickles down to everyone. Another view: as a board, you must deal with culture challenges as they arise or they come back to bite you. Hallelujah to that. Don't kick the can down the road. The BBC situation, the Trump issue, really underlines how crucial a board's role is in monitoring organisational culture, even though we can't and rightly shouldn't oversee everything. Another quote for me, the nose in, hands out principle is particularly relevant. Boards need to be close enough to detect shifts in tone, behaviour and risk appetite, all part of culture, but disciplined enough not to try to run the operations. Another one, I personally don't think a board alone can set the tone or culture, but it does have a part to play, and that's true of committees. The board should be exploring to ensure it understands the organisational culture and what that means for success, productivity and reputation. Some of that culture should be about risk and control, as well as the wider employee engagement side of things and helping people do the right things in the right way. So a lot of different varying views, supporting, not supporting, but all interesting to discuss, which you'll get to do in the breakout groups. So to close, from my perspective, I just don't believe NEDs are observers. They're part of an organisation, just in a different way than the executive, and they're contributors to culture and inclusion. Effective boards treat culture as a continuous priority, asking better questions, seeking that unfiltered insight, getting underneath the board papers and the information, and challenge constructively. I think culture is and should be governed by the board, and that NEDs play a pivotal role in ensuring it becomes an asset rather than a liability, and that it truly helps the organisation to achieve its goals, its vision and its strategy. I don't know if I'm in 10 minutes, Sarah, or over 10 minutes, but there is the end.
Don't worry at all. Thank you so much, Louise. Wow. Yes, culture does totally bleed through everything, and I think you've articulated that really well. I am just going to share my screen. So these are our 3 questions for today that we're going to have a pause to think about in a moment. What examples have you seen of both good and bad impact of the board on the trickle-down culture? NEDs are often reliant on curated information. How do you get beneath the surface of the board papers to understand the culture and its impact on strategy? And then lastly, what have you seen from a board perspective that's actually shifted culture? Have you seen things change? We'd love to hear about that. We'll take a few minutes now just of silence where you can just think through these questions yourselves, and then we are going to jump into breakout rooms.